Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, a Pittsburgh Steelers podcast made by fans like you, for fans like you. Now, here's your host, Joe Kuzma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. My name's Joe Kuzma, and today we're going to be answering a very important question. And that question is Heath Miller a future Hall of Famer? Could Heath Miller be enshrined alongside other tight end greats, other historical players at his position? And if you're living in Pittsburgh, the answer might be a lot easier than if you don't. And here's why. When we look at statistics and we look at numbers and we look at things that are measurable, Heath Miller certainly is a guy that's atop the charts in Pittsburgh. All-time receptions for a tight end, all-time receiving yards for a tight end, all-time touchdowns for a tight end, 167 starts, 11 seasons, played in 3 Super Bowls, has 2 Super Bowl rings, went to the Pro Bowl twice. And when you look at the tight end position in the present day, you have to compare Heath Miller. Well, let's rewind a little bit. We're going to compare Heath Miller to some of the guys that are already in the Hall of Fame, some of the guys that are on the list ahead of him. And I'm somewhat advocating that maybe Heath Miller is one of these guys that eventually squeaks into the Hall of Fame, because anytime you retire, you go out on top and you're among the best of your peers. I believe that that's a Hall of Fame career. But Heath Miller did it so quietly, and Heath Miller was a player that, let's face it, if you are a fantasy football player, like I am, and I've been doing fantasy football for the last 16 or 17 years, Heath Miller's not a guy that even gets drafted. And I'm talking about you have 10 or 12 teams in the league. Everybody's going to take a tight end. Sometimes you're going to take 2. There's only 32 tight ends in the NFL, unless, of course, you have a team that might be playing with double tight ends. In that case, production might not be there. But Heath Miller's not putting up video game numbers like Antonio Brown. He's not putting up video game numbers like guys that are below him on this list. And when I speak of the lists, I have a corresponding article over on SteelCityUnderground.com. The same title, is Heath Miller a future Hall of Famer? And when I made this post, I wanted to list some of the measurables. You have the tight ends. Some of them are marked with an asterisk if they're already in the Hall of Fame. Some of them are current players. And you have some guys recently retired like Tony Gonzalez, arguably one of the greatest of all time. You still have Jason Witten and Antonio Gates that are still playing. And those are the type of guys that are putting up the video game numbers like Antonio Brown. You have guys that are below Heath Miller on this list. They'll certainly catch him, if not surpass him, like Greg Olsen with the Carolina Panthers or Rob Gronkowski, probably the most obvious choice that's further down on this list. And you see some of the guys that are maybe on this list that probably aren't Hall of Famers, like maybe Jeremy Shockey. But where it really differs is Heath Miller, right now, he ranks 11th all-time in receiving yards, 45 touchdowns. And Heath Miller has 592 receptions, which is good for 7th all-time. Now, touchdowns, he's a little further down the list, but he's in good company. You take a look at some of the players that are in the Hall of Fame already. And we're going to take a look at, like, Ozzie Newsome. Ozzie Newsome played 198 games. He started 191 games. And Heath Miller played in 168, started 167. He was a starter a lot longer than Ozzie Newsome, had a shorter career. Ozzie Newsome, 662 receptions, 7,980 yards, only 2 more touchdowns. Was Ozzie more valuable than Heath Miller? Debatable. You look at the era. You look at Kellen Winslow. Kellen Winslow, 109 games, 94 starts. Only 541 receptions. That actually places him about Well, 51 below Heath Miller. 6,741 yards and 45 touchdowns. Kellen Winslow, thought of as one of the most dominant tight ends of his era. And that could be true. You can't really measure the numbers because Kellen Winslow played about a third less of the games that Heath Miller did. But does that necessarily mean that Kellen Winslow is any less of a contributor and any more important to a team than Heath Miller was? Remember, Heath Miller, two-time Super Bowl champion, played in 3 Super Bowls. Guy wasn't flashy, and that's why he's probably not going to get the attention that some of these other players are going to get. And you look down the list, you have Mike Ditka. And Mike Ditka is pretty much in the same category. Way less receptions of 427, 5,812 receiving yards, and 43 touchdowns, 2 less touchdowns. Mike Ditka played in 158 games and only started 98. Mike Ditka any less valuable to his team than Heath Miller? And I'd argue no. But, again, when you're looking at the big picture and you're outside of the Pittsburgh area, everyone in Pittsburgh already knows. Heath Miller, one of the all-time greats. You're going to sit there, you may have kids, or your siblings may have kids, and you're going to talk to those young ones when you're trying to pass on the Pittsburgh legacy of when you were growing up and you were watching players like Ben Roethlisberger and Troy Polamalu. And Heath Miller is most certainly one of those names that are going to pop up. But unlike the other 2 aforementioned names, when you're talking Big Ben and you're talking Troy, we know they're surefire Hall of Famers. They should be first ballot Hall of Famers. Though, I will argue, as many others will, Ben still doesn't get the respect he deserves. Will Heath Miller get the respect he deserves? Measurables, he's there. He's close, and he's on par. But because only the crowd yelled Heath and not Heath Miller himself, maybe he won't have the due attention or the spotlight on him to give him that nudge. But perhaps when we see some players that finally get their name called, you get someone like Kevin Green, had an outstanding career. Kevin Green, any less a contributor on the 3 teams that he played for? I say no. Kevin Green's a deserving Hall of Famer, but I have my doubts as to whether or not Kevin Green's name would have been called this year or any year in the near future. And congratulations to Kevin Green, by the way. But we're talking about Heath Miller. Is Heath Miller a future Hall of Famer? And the only answer I can give you is in the gray area. Maybe.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.